So I'm Terry Kongle, and on behalf of the Q Steering Committee, we want to welcome Sally Crowe. I think it's really important at these events that we have the international perspective. The UK is doing some terrific research. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have Sally join us. You can read her information in our bio. So, Sally.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I've so enjoyed the content and the discussions and the questions so far. There's much for me to take back to the UK. So I facilitate public engagement in healthcare research on a paid and a voluntary basis, and I've been doing that for about 25 years. My disclosure is I have worked for one pharmaceutical company, facilitating 2 workshops on chronic pain, and mainly because one of my personal interests in research, where I make my own personal contribution to research, is in chronic pain. It's also in women's health and mental health. I have particular professional interests in research priorities, outcomes, and partnership working for better evidence. Before I start my presentation, I just want to pay a personal tribute to someone who we lost recently. Rosamond Snow was a patient leader in the UK and more widely known as the British Medical Journal's patient editor. Amongst many other roles that she inhabited as a service user researcher and as a campaigner, she was a friend, collaborator, and I personally will miss her and her contribution greatly. I will touch again on the British Medical Journal later on in my presentation. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I want to outline how I see patient and public involvement, and that's how we talk about it in the UK. We don't really use the word consumer, although I know that happens here and in Cochrane, but it's generally patient and public involvement, shortened to PPI or PI. Now, why would I be telling you about that when you're all real experts in it, right? Well, I'm doing it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it allows you to make comparisons between your experience and my experience, and also because I've noticed over the years that we do need to define what we're talking about, because I think there are blurred boundaries around public involvement and qualitative research, for example, or participation in trials, and sometimes I see the two getting mixed up in a bit of a jumble. So I just want to clear up any of those issues before I move into how we do it in the UK, what are the critical success factors and some examples, and then be a bit critical and think about future directions. I'm not sure it does work in the UK. I think it works to a degree, and it depends how you define the word work. But I will share with you what I think is going well and what I think we could do better on. So the theme of this summit then is power of patient advocacy. And I wanted to draw your attention to one of my visions of this is like a continuum, it's like a journey. And as we go through that journey, we move from places of awareness or consultation and one-way conversations to something way more powerful at the top of that continuum, where we talk about empowerment or even user control. And I'll keep coming back to power as a theme in my presentation. I feel quite strongly about that. At the end of the day, these are words. They're just words. And it's interesting how we get in a pickle about words in this world. We get worried about what we mean when we talk about collaboration or involvement or engagement. At the end of the day, it's what we do that really matters. I think this continuum applies personally for individual healthcare, but also for systems healthcare, which I guess is what the EGAPS conference is about, developing guidance, and of course for societal healthcare. And I think it operates in all those 3 places. But here's another way of looking at it, which I think is actually much easier to grasp. And this is the one I use when I'm working with lots of diverse groups of people. And I've built on something that Sherry Arnstein developed in the 60s, which was around civic engagement. And also I've taken some guidance from, I'm sure some of you know Dave E. Bronckhart, and he added some to the levels. So level 1 is then, well, here's what we're doing. So that's a one-way conversation to me. Level 2 is, what do you think about what we're doing? So we're asking for some feedback. Level 3 is, we'd like you to get involved in what we're doing, and we will support you. Level 4 is, what do you think we should be doing? So now we're exceeding some of that control. We're saying, well, what do you think is the priorities here? Okay, let's do that together, and we will support you. And then finally, level 5, which is perhaps where we reach the empowerment control end of our continuum, is you do what's important and needed, and we will support you. And I think that's, for me, that's quite a helpful way of thinking about patient and public involvement. It's not static, it's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes ladders aren't always the most useful way of depicting it. So another thing I'm going to put up on the screen now is something that's way more complex. So this is deliberately complex. I want you to think of this as complex, but actually in a good way. It's a busy slide, because actually what it's showing is we have choices. We have choices about how we do this stuff. So the axes really depict the level of engagement or involvement that we're going for, so moving left to right or bottom to top. So the things on the outer rim of that map are things where I would say we're really working together here. We're really, really working on a shared agenda, and we're achieving things together. And when I first developed this map, which we did for a book, which is referenced at the bottom, technology, amazingly, didn't even really exist. It's quite an old book. And I thought I'd just draw out a couple of examples from the technology part of the map. So, for example, in the online data repository and symptom trackers, we have experience, so that's in the top left-hand corner, we have endeavours like Patients Like Me, where we have patients uploading and accessing their symptoms and allowing them to share across with each other. There's a community of interest, but also some of that data, with their permission, is being used for research. I don't think we could have really thought of those things 15, 20 years ago. And the internet has given us so many more opportunities of where we choose the activity that we're going to do. And on a more personal level, the internet has given us bloggers who give us windows into their lives of living with a long-term or a life-limiting condition. And I want to draw your attention to someone I follow on social media, and who's also a member of a patient panel that I belong to, Sarah Rigare. This is the title of her blog, Not Patient, but Impatient. So I think that's quite clever. And this is an infographic, and what she was doing here in this blog was talking about her self-management, how much she spends on her self-management, and putting the blog into the context of her life of living with Parkinson's. And what this image shows you is just how much of that time she spends self-managing, and the red dot is how much time she spends in neurological health care. And what I love about this infographic is the ability to transmit a very important and key message about self-management powerfully. And when I tweeted this, there was just a whole flurry of interest and traffic to her blog, which was fantastic. So how we go about this thing called patient and public involvement will be determined by many factors, and I'll come on to those midway through my presentation. But I think we've already talked today about the table and sitting around the table, and I would challenge you and say there are many other ways of doing this, and that actually maybe in guidelines the table is the thing, but it's not the only thing. Okay, so before I came over to America, for this presentation, I did a bit of consultation with some colleagues in the UK and asked them to tell me their top 5 things that they thought really made a difference in public involvement in research. And these are in no particular order, but they were very consistently relayed back to me from these people. And they are clarity of purpose, leadership, partnership, structure and support, and foundations and evidence. And I'll just run through those in turn. So on the clarity then, in the UK, we have a rich history of having one-line phrases that relate to patient and public involvement. We've already had one today, nothing about me without me. We have patient-centered. We have patients at the heart of what we do, patient centricity. and so on and so on. And I have to say, sometimes I have a bit of a heart sink moment. I think, okay, that's wonderful, but what does it actually mean? And I think around clarity, what we need is, what is it we want to do? Why do we want to do it? How are we going to do it? Who's going to do it with us? And then so what? What's the point of it all? How we know we've been successful? The second issue was leadership. And I'm talking about leadership inside the system and leadership outside the system. And this has already come up today. We had righteous indignation, and Greg was talking earlier about ACT UP and how we bring together people's movement to change things. And I think we need leadership in both the system but also outside the system, and I will call those people disruptive leaders. They're people that upend the normal way of doing things and challenge the orthodoxy. And actually in the UK we have a name for them. We call them the boat rockers. And I really like that because it's not too aggressive, but it does suggest that we're jumbling things up. And in fact, I've had a couple of boat rockers on Twitter today, following this Twitter feed from this conference, making suggestions, sending over papers, being provocative, and I think bring it on. We need that sort of leadership too. We need partnership because we'll achieve more together than apart, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. We definitely need structure and support. It's vital to keep the show on the road, and I'll detail what I think that looks like in a minute. And finally, we need evidence and the foundations for that evidence. And I think it is incumbent upon us to share and evaluate what we think works well in public involvement and what doesn't work so well. The moral argument, the rights argument, I'm totally with that. But the system will probably listen to evidence much, much more. So we do need to build that evidence base. So my next two slides are a little bit busy. They sort of take us through the structure for public involvement in the UK, and I apologise if they're a bit boring, but I did think it was worth just being really clear to you what has happened in the last 10 years, how it relates to this particular slide, and where I think it's helped us progress public involvement. So we have a National Institute for Health Research, like you do, and the key thing about that is it has been totally supportive of public involvement for the whole 10 years it's been up and running. We have a 10-year strategy called Going the Extra Mile, so it's acknowledging we've made progress, but there's more to do. And the number one issue in that strategy is diversity, and bringing a much more diverse group and number of people to our activities in public involvement. In the funding structures, we also have a very well walked path of public involvement, peer review, we've talked about that today. The thing to say about that is that in funding, the funders are preferential to proposals that have really good public involvement, descriptions, plans, budgets, it's resourced, and actually indicate how they got to the point of developing that research question. That came out earlier about how do we involve people in the early doors of this sort of research endeavour. We have a coordinating centre, which is called Involve. And we have a clinical research network, just as you do, I'm sure. I think what's interesting about that is there are now over 100 PI leads. So their only job is to ensure that people get involved in research. And I recently ran a strategy day for these people, and I just couldn't believe I was stood up like here now and looking out on this room of 100 plus people thinking, what an amazing development that is. So we now have people whose job it is to make this happen. And then we have the National Health Service, which every day I feel grateful for. And it's interesting, we've switched our focus from trying to recruit people through academic institutions actually to the NHS, because that's where the majority of people are, regardless of their age, their gender, their race, their wealth. Most people need the NHS at some point in their life. So we do want to engage with them in that setting as well. Then we have our academic institutions who now have public involvement networks around sort of communicating science. It tends to be a more one-way type of communication, but it's established. We have medical research charities who endorse and support public involvement, and we have patient organisations who are growing their experience and examples of public involvement. And I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I don't think all patient organisations actually know how to talk to their membership. And I've certainly worked with patient organisations who actually did not consult with their membership on quite important research issues, and I'm glad to say that's changing. And then we have our research and clinical journals. So we have two journals that are based in the UK, but of course are international, which look at the science of involvement. One's called, I'm going to forget them now because it's that sort of day. There's two journals. One is BMC, Research Involvement and Engagement. The other one's called Research for All. I've got information about them at the end of my presentation. But I think more powerfully, and I don't want to denigrate what they're doing because it's great to be able to read really nicely written accounts of public involvement and evaluation of those. But the British Medical Journal, which is the premier journal for doctors in the UK and maybe even wider, I don't know, has taken a really bold step and has said that we want our content to be much more concerned with the patient experience and view of healthcare. They set up a patient panel, of which I'm very privileged to be a member, and they've set up a peer review process where patients and the public now review early content. And that's probably more impactful, I would argue, than actually our specialist journals. And then finally, we have our leaders, and I won't labour the point because I've already talked about some of them. But the Health Service Journal, which is our local sort of, our UK health rag, if you like, had a list of 50 patient leaders, which they were awarded last year, and they called them the quiet revolutionaries. Some of them aren't so quiet. Alison Cameron, who I've been tweeting with today, she's a boat rocker, she's a disruptor, and we've just crowdfunded her to go to Stanford MedX in about a month's time, I think it is. So we do need those patient leaders as well as system leaders. And in all that, we need to support our patients and the public by providing training and development, not just about research and evidence. It's actually about communication skills, how to make a case, how to make a convincing case for change. We've talked about practical support and payment, and the position in the UK is that we do pay people. And we've talked about peer support and networking. What we haven't talked about is emotional and psychological support, and I think there's a gap there. I did a coaching qualification a few years ago, and for my coachees, I worked with patient leaders and people involved in research, and it gave us a structure to explore the emotional and psychological implications of putting their health out there for the world to inspect and comment on and react to. And I think it was really interesting that the coaching model is maybe going to be picked up as a method of supporting the emotional and psychological impact of doing the sort of work that you do. I just need to mention Involve. They've been around a long time. And what's interesting about Involve is they've changed. They've gone from being slightly a font of knowledge, this is how you do it, to a coordinating centre. So there's an acknowledgement that the skills base and the experience now exists out in the networks and in the hospitals and in the academic institutions and in the patient groups. And Involve's work is to draw that together and make sense of it, not to be the expert anymore. And I think that's a terrific step forward for them. And I hope that some of you may make it over to the Involve conference later this year. What I want to do now is just run through about 5 or 6 examples of the sort of stuff I've been talking about, and then I'll finish up with some challenges. So my first example is awareness. So this is called the Patient Research Ambassadors Initiative. And the covert mission of this initiative, it recognises that a lot of people use the health service, and that's where we should be, volunteering, promoting health research to others. And in fact, there's been a big push last year with a project called It's OK to Ask, where people were encouraged to ask about research, encouraged to ask about joining clinical trials, encouraged to ask about their options. And I thought that was a terrific initiative. Simon Stone's there on the right-hand side. I first met Simon about 5 or 6 years ago. He's a health activist, and now he's a doctoral researcher. And he blogs at something called Arthur's Place, which is a social network for young adults with rheumatology conditions. And Simon's a brilliant example of someone who's come through the system and started off as an ambassador and is now ploughing his own brilliant way in research, bringing to bear his own personal experiences to that. The second example I won't dwell on because we've actually talked about it. It's about plain language or plain English summaries. But you know, this puzzles me. It's a small thing to write a summary when you get a £1 million research project. I don't understand why it's difficult to do, but we did have a real problem in the NIHR with many, many studies on public portals that did not have a concise description of what they were about. And I did wonder if it was part of a sort of bigger power conspiracy around, you know, not making it easy for people to find out about research. And I do think that this small thing, if we get it right, really opens up transparency, intent, and invitation to get involved. And so I think it's a really important thing, but it feels on the face of it quite a small thing in the bigger picture. Example 3, this is very close to my heart. This is prioritization. So I was helped set up the James Lind Alliance, 12 years ago now, with this chap called Ian Chalmers, who I didn't know then was really quite important. It was a bit news to me. Terrific guy. And we helped set it up. And the idea was precisely something that was said this morning about this gap between research that's useful to people living day to day. And so it's a process for achieving shared priorities in healthcare research that incorporates the perspectives and experiences of patients, the public, and healthcare professionals. 5-step process, nothing really radical about that. We get top 10 priorities. It's nearly always a top 10 because it like trips off the tongue, people get it, it's interesting. And we've been around a while and there's over 65 ongoing or completed partnerships now. And I do remember at the very beginning, we nearly gave up after 2 years. It was so difficult to do. And it was very easy just to walk away from it, but we decided to keep going, and I'm really glad we did. But I did remember in a meeting, a very eminent professor came up to me and said, Sally, this is all a bit populist, isn't it? It's like, yes, it is. That's the general idea, is that we take away the mask and the mystique of research and make it accessible to people. And just as an example, in the bipolar partnership, over 3,283 people suggested research questions. That's populist to me. They ranged across a very broad area of a population of interest. And the way we managed to achieve that was a combination of a process that was really simple. We wanted people to tell us what was important in their lives in their own words. It was up to us to do the translating and the sorting out of the data. So we did. Over 3,000 people responded. 14.5 individual research questions came through. That was the shocking bit. The other reason it was really popular was because, who's heard of Stephen Fry in the room? Yeah, so he retweeted just one tweet. Stephen Fry retweeted to his millions of followers, and we just saw this massive peak in visitors to the survey. Very simple SurveyMonkey survey. Anyway, out of those 14,500 questions and checking the evidence and all that stuff that we do in the James Lind, we came down to 71, which tells you immediately there was a lot of repetition across people's experiences, which was interesting in itself. And then 2,200 people voted online for their top 10, and then we took I think it was 35 of those, the top 35 went to a workshop with about 35 people, and they then decided the top 10, and I helped facilitate that workshop, and it was a great privilege to do so. So people say, why is the JLA so, why has it worked? And I don't think there's anything mystical about it at all. I think it's because we have clear principles about equality and equity of participation. There's a really clear outcome and a goal. The methods are all online. There's nothing published behind paywalls. It's all out there for people to use. We address conflicts of interest in our interactions with each other, and I'd say it's not precious. So what happens to JLA priorities? Because it's no point doing this stuff unless something actually happens as a result. This is tinnitus, the hearing disorder, the 9th partnership to complete in 2012, And out of the 10 priorities, about 8 generated a research response, and I'll leave you with the different types of research that happened as a result of that partnership. Other priorities are picked up as well outside the top 10. Has this had an impact on healthcare? Somebody said earlier, it's all about the impact on healthcare. I think it's probably too early to say that, but we should definitely be evaluating for that. Example 4 then is setting expectations. So we're developing national standards for public involvement in research. And this is not a universally popular idea. It's quite interesting. Some people have a very visceral response to us saying, this is what we expect of you as research organisations when you work with your public. But actually, if we want a more consistent experience for people when they get involved, we need to know what it looks like when it's good, what it feels like when it's good, and what it's like when it's very good, so that organisations can aspire and be ambitious and benchmark themselves against each other. A particular interest of mine is outcomes, measuring what matters. And this is a Tower of Babel. I had to look this up on Wikipedia because I wasn't entirely sure. So Tower of Babel is all about variation of language. And it's really, the person who did this is using the Tower of Babel as a metaphor for the proliferation of outcome measures in eczema. There's way too many, some of which have only ever been used once, definitely not validated. How are we going to cope with all these different ways of measuring outcomes? So what do? You ask people what's important to them to measure, both clinicians and patients and the public. And the 3 points I want to make about this slide are following. 1, patients despair when they see this sort of example. They often don't understand why we would get into a situation like this. Number 2, that the home example has been a model of working with patients and the public, and every meeting there's at least 20% partnership with people with eczema. I'd like to see more. Oh my goodness. But here we go. And finally, the guy who runs it, called Howell Williams, Professor Howell Williams in Nottingham, he's all about the family. He talks about the respect that we need to give each other to work together effectively, and I'm all for that. So here's Cochrane in the UK, 2 different experiences. One is using someone's blog to illustrate the results of a systematic review. Annette shares her experience with the publication of a systematic review. The other is looking at it the other way, is what evidence can we use to help people make everyday health choices? And these have been very successful initiatives from UK Cochrane. So, as I finish up, are things changing? Yes. I'm not sure about all of these, but I'm going to put them out for you because I think they'll help generate discussion. We might be moving from something called involvement to co-production. Co-production is another one of those words. It means we do stuff together. I think we might be moving from the individual to the community, from clinical research to health research. We talked about public health earlier. From a public involvement process to focusing more on outcomes and impact. I do think we're becoming less centrally controlled and more citizen-driven, and I think we're moving out of the committee room, even with our lovely big tables. And I think we need to go global. And I know there are plans afoot to try and pull together an international network for public involvement in research. So what are our challenges? I've already mentioned diversity. There's a paradox. We might be over-representing those already resourceful and equipped in regards to research, and we want to avoid that. I think we do need to honour people's priorities. We need to make sure that when people say what's important, we respond to that. We need to check the power, the privilege in the room. We need to acknowledge where it's different and what we can do about it. And we need to develop models and methods that incorporate evaluation, because evidence and proof is what people want and need to convince them of the value of doing this work. And finally, I think we need to invest more in relationship building, partnerships, and collaboration. And the reason they don't get invested in is because they take time, they require patience, and we are dealing with controversies and confrontation. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the way that my MO works is that it's all about the P's. It's about working in partnership. I'm a big believer in principles and values that underpin your work, because you can return to them when things are going off track and get back on track again, and so on. And I do think we do need to be bold. We need to proceed and be bold. And my final slide is courtesy of Hilda Bastian. Some of you may know. I love this. She was speaking at Evidence Live last year, and she was talking about resisting certainty, staying in the difficult places, and listening to and working with those that you disagree with to push forward. So thank you very much for your attention. And there's some things I was talking about earlier. Okay, thank you.
Sally, I think what you've said about the about James Lind Alliance and having ambassadors that are really active is terrific. We will now turn this over to Marguerite, who has some other comments.
Great. That was a really great presentation, Sally. Thank you so much. And I have to say, you know, there's so much to discuss, but I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to highlight a few things and sort of throw out what I think might be a contentious question at the end that might facilitate some discussion. First, I think we should recognize that there are differences in our healthcare systems and structures. What happens in the UK, which is a publicly funded system, versus here in the United States, where we have, you know, a private insurance, we have, you know, different healthcare systems, we have different provider groups. There are two very different systems. Even though there are differences, I can see a lot of things that we do very similarly to what's happening in the UK. And I think that that's very important. We might do them somewhat differently, we might have different kinds of problems, but when we have the question, you know, if it works in the UK, will it work in the US? You know, I think it's very provocative, and I think the answer at this point is maybe. And I'd like to talk about, you know, some things that are going on. Despite the different structures that we have in our healthcare systems and, you know, how our governments are organized, I think here in the U.S. we've made significant progress with public involvement in healthcare. And I'm thinking, you know, back to even the 70s when the disease advocacy organizations really came on strong. We had Greg talking about, you know, the work in AIDS advocacy, and there were a lot of other groups where they really started to, you know, get the public engaged and also started to raise funds and actually support the research that is being done on specific diseases. I think that was really an essential awakening in the United States for a lot of people about their disease, their stake in it, and what it really meant to them. So I think we've done a lot of work in that area, and also just developing networks among those organizations as well. One of the major developments I think we have had in the United States is really the development of PCORI. To me, that really launched, you know, this whole purpose about having consumers or the public or patients or whatever you want to call them involved not only in health services research, but also involved in the development of clinical practice guidelines. And without that kind of structure that's funded to do those kinds of things, I'm not sure that we'd be at the point that we are already. So to me, PCORI was really a major landmark in terms of, you know, public involvement in healthcare. I think they've made considerable progress moving patient engagement forward. Especially, I'd like to highlight the patient-powered research networks where the patients are really partnering with researchers to actually get research done. That's really important, and bringing those two groups together and also empowering consumers, or the public and patients, to really have a say in the types of research that is done and also largely contribute, you know, to the implementation of those research projects. And I think also that PCORI has done a great deal in terms of embedding public involvement in the research structure. That to me is important. You can be an outsider and you may be able to, you know, share a few comments on the research and outcomes and things like that. But if this is really going to work as a movement, you have to embed consumers right in the structure of the process. And to me, that's been a major success, you know, with PCORI, and I like what they've done in the UK, and especially with, you know, with Project Involve, in that really is embedding the public in the research right up front, and there is a lot of support for that. I want to give a shout out to Q, because I think the founding of that organization and the network that all of you provide here is extremely powerful and underutilized at this point. And I think that there are ways in working with PCORI and other groups that, you know, we could move the agenda forward as well. One thing that I've been very pleased to see, and this is more of like what's happening in the UK, although they're doing it from a government perspective, is that even though we have separate healthcare systems here in the United States, a lot of them are getting on the bandwagon with patient advisory councils. That is a major change in our healthcare system, where they are saying, wait a minute, we can deliver care, but we can't deliver it well without direct patient input. And so even an organization like Kaiser, I've gotten to know a little bit more about their patient advisory councils. They are involving patients in everything from the structure of hospitals, the design, to quality initiatives, to, you know, we're considering actually moving them into our guideline panels now and really making a go of that, because it's become so important. We're one of many organizations that are doing that now, and I think that that's a landscape of a change. And as far as guidelines are concerned, I really think that the IOM standards that included patient involvement in systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines, and also enforcing that through the National Guideline Clearinghouse, at least they've enforced systematic reviews. What I have proposed before to Q members is that the next step is for the National Guideline Clearinghouse to say, we want all the organizations whose guidelines are accepted on this site to have patients involved in their process. I don't think that's going to happen unless there is, you know, some kind of carrot out there that says you have to do this in order to be an acceptable, trustworthy guideline. So I think we're moving in those directions, and I think it, you know, it really is a positive direction for us. Can the involved model work in the United States? Well, I think we would need additional support for patients and public, such as training, you know, payment of the public involved, peer support, especially helping those networks to thrive, you know, citizen involvement in healthcare, and I think we have a long way to go with that, and I'm hoping that, you know, PCORI and other organizations can really make strides in that area. What really bothers me is the current fragmented structure of U.S. healthcare, the political environment that we're currently in, and potential cuts in Health and Human Services and NIH funding. I don't think that those bode very well for a centralized UK-like funding structure here in the United States to make it happen. Personally, I think the way PCORI is set up right now, in that they're part of a trust and it's out of direct involvement to some degree, is probably good given our political situation and some of the things that are happening. I'd like to sort of end this with just a question for discussion, that, you know, we're living in an era where there's fake news and alternative facts and the questioning of science and evidence at its very basic levels. I mean, what actions can and should be taken to make patient engagement or public engagement part of healthcare culture and practice? Really trying to embed that in the culture of healthcare and research. How can we do that given the current challenges we have in a culture that is really showing that, you know, there's fake news and there are alternative facts and really questioning evidence. So I'm going to end there, and I know many of you probably have lots of questions to Sally and her excellent presentation, so thanks very much.
Happy spring to everyone, by the way.
Hello.
I am Mahshid Lutfi. I am with the University of Washington in Seattle as patient advisor. I really enjoyed today very much. I learned a lot, and thank you very much. The only point I want to make is that I see a lot of emphasis on patients' involvement, patients' education, patients' engagement, but much less about physicians and doctors, deeper involvement, real involvement. Most of the time I see that you can see that they are there because they should be there, but they don't really think that those patients can teach them anything. So maybe we need a little bit of training, education or something for them to really do believe in the benefits of involving patients. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a terrific point. And I think there's a lot of fear around working with the public, sometimes from professional perspectives. They worry they're going to say the wrong thing or they're going to upset somebody. And when we're scared of things, we sometimes just don't do them. And I think the training and development needs to span across professionals as well as patients. And actually, the issues are pretty much the same. It's probably why I prefer a partnership model for working, because I think then you're doing it together. You're learning together, you're sharing together. And I have seen the most cynical physicians completely change their perspective when they've worked in a James Lind partnership, because they've learned the tools of the trade of how to communicate with patients and the public on an equal footing, not in a clinic, in a research setting, and it's very, very different. And I remember in the schizophrenia partnership, we were at the workshop and we were talking about the side effects of antipsychotic drugs. And one of the questions that we were discussing was sexual function in relation to antipsychotics. And this was a really important feature for people with schizophrenia. It was why they took holidays from their drugs, because they wanted to have sex. It's not unreasonable. And afterwards, the clinician came up to me and said, I've never once asked a patient in my clinic about sex and psychotic drugs. He said, and that's what I'm taking away today is I see people with schizophrenia and I see the schizophrenia. I don't see the person. So there for me was learning alongside the process of prioritization, which was actually way more powerful in some ways. So you're right, we need to do both. Yeah.
Hi, Sally. I had a question for you. Alexandra Richardson, who ran the Durham trials, she presented at one of our, I run a nonprofit for children with communication impairments, and one of the differences I've seen between the UK and the US is that when she did research, she went into the school system and they worked with the children in the schools. They gave them fish oils, and she did more than one study, and we discussed about the differences between that would never happen in the United States, like that they would be doing a study in the schools like that. It was a large study with the school, or maybe it would happen. I mean, but at the time they were saying it wouldn't, and I wanted to get your and everyone's viewpoint on how they got the public engaged in the studies there. And she said that they're more about nutrition there than they are here in the United States.
I think there's been a bit of a thread about this through the day, is about I think and I'm not a researcher, I'm a facilitator of engagement, I'm very clear about that. I think sometimes when I work with researchers, they expect the dialogue to come to them. And the most effective work has always been when they've gone out to the setting in which it's appropriate to work, be it a school, a community centre, a mum and baby clinic. And in fact, one of the first lessons I learned was in prostate cancer, and I was doing some involvement work. And in prostate cancer, I think it's right, you've got a 4 times chance in men of getting prostate cancer if you're black. I think that's right. It's very.
There's a 60% greater likelihood if you're African American of getting prostate cancer and 151% greater likelihood of mortality.
Thank you for that clarification. And the research team was saying, well, we'll just get some people to come into us, and we said, no, let's go out into the community. We went to the domino clubs. I don't know if that's a feature here, but in the UK there's domino clubs where men play dominoes and just like shoot the breeze and talk about their lives and whatever. And then the women are in the kitchen doing these amazing spread of food. So we split up, and I went into the kitchen and my co-worker went into the domino club, and we worked on that basis in that setting, and it was way more successful in terms of engaging with them and finding out what they were interested in. I don't understand why it wouldn't happen in a school in the US. Is that?
I think they said because of the legalities. I mean, I think there's a lot more attorneys here and like laws. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not really sure,
Okay.
but I just wanted to share that because I thought it
Yeah,
was
it's a
really
really good
amazing
point.
what she did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sally.
Hi.
My name is Diana Chingos. I'm a cancer patient advocate in Los Angeles. So I, too, was very impressed when the British Medical Journal decided to invite patients to take part in peer review for publications. And I signed up to do that.
Yay.
Do you hold sway with them at all?
You're going to tell me the process is rubbish, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yep, I agree with you. So the theory's great, the idea's great. What they have to work on is how they run it. And in fact, the first time I did it as a patient, not as a professional, they kept calling me Dr. Crowe, and I said, I'm not a doctor. You just need to get those little details right. if we could talk offline about it, I'd be very happy to take back your
Well, I mean,
comments.
That didn't offend me so much as, it's unpaid.
Yeah,
And somebody else could say, oh, well, we don't pay experts to do this either, right?
Yeah.
But they would send me a very long article, publication, that they would then completely say, oh, you know, we're not going to publish this after all. So sorry. Yeah, it was a lot of work. I was also going to say that I've seen Sarah Regar,
yeah,
who's on here at Medicine X, tell her story.
Yeah.
If anybody here wants to see an exceptional
It
patient
is,
story,
yeah.
go to YouTube and look for her. It's really
Yeah.
amazing.
yeah.
Thank you.
But could we just chat afterwards? And I'd quite like to take back your comments.
Try not to drop it this time. Hello, my name is Janice Tufty, and I would like to ask you a few questions, Sally, about your, is it public involvement, the 100 leaders?
Patient leaders.
Patient leaders.
Yeah.
So I was just comparing it to the work I've been trying to do in the United States in my little area, but I'm thinking of the size of the United States versus UK, right? And we don't have 100 public, right? We don't have our patient involvement leaders. And I wonder how many individuals they reach out to, or how that works. Are they reimbursed? You give them training? I mean, they offer volunteer. I wondered how the whole project works, or the position.
So the public involvement leads, as they're called, so they're institutional. They work in a research institution of some description. Their main job is to make it as easy as possible for people to get involved, whether that's arranging a taxi pickup, it could be training and
Wow.
development, it could be having that pre-meeting conversation. We saw that modeled in the Q video.
Do they
having that
recruit them
conversation.
too?
Sorry?
They recruit them as well?
No, actually, it's mostly the research teams that recruit, but they look to the public involvement leads for advice on how to go about that well.
So it's like liaisons, or sort of like liaisons, sort of.
Like
A liaison, somebody that helps
A liaison.
create the
Got it.
path
Yeah.
for the people, the patients, to be able to come in.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're like the liaison people. They like pull people together and just make the basics work, because so often these things fail because the basics are missed.
Well, that's a great opportunity. I hope to see something like that here. Thank you.
And some of them are, the really interesting thing about the group is that they're not homogenous. They're not similar at all. They come from a really wide range of backgrounds and experiences
That's what
and
you
skill
need
sets.
to
Yeah.
get the general, right. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I'll try to speak up.
How's your voice going?
All right. Kay Dickerson, and I'm from Johns Hopkins and the U.S. Cochrane Center, and Q. I wasn't going to ask this because it seems a little off topic from what we're talking about, but I thought maybe you could help, and since there seemed to be some time. What we found in our PCORI-funded study is that we had patient investigators, co-investigators, which are required in PCORI, and I think that's good. And then we were looking for outcomes that were important to the patients. And we found that the patients could identify, but they didn't feel right prioritizing them. And we looked in other sources also. So prioritizing them was hard, which you do in the James Lind Alliance. And so we tried an experiment of bringing in a patient advocacy organization, because it would be much more people than just 2 people, to see if they could help us prioritize, which they did. And we found a couple things that I thought you might comment on your experience. One is that the benefits of treatment, let's say a drug treatment, are pretty easy to identify and prioritize because they're a small number. It's like, get rid of my symptoms. Pain, you mentioned. But side effects are where it's tricky. That what our patients said, who are co-investigators, is we want to know about every possible side effect, whether you consider it patient-centered or whether it's doctor-centered. And that was and they all wanted to know about sexual function regarding whatever the drug was, which was never on any list anywhere. So I think we have to always consider it, not just where we're finding it out. And so I find this interesting. First of all, can involving just a couple of patients who may not have a constituency actually inform the research project? Can I, as just one epidemiologist inform it. Obviously, I'm going to put my own stamp on it. But what are we expecting of these consumers? Is it too much that we expect them to bring all consumer views, if they aren't part of a constituency, to the table? And then this interesting finding that makes sense, that first of all, there are very few benefits. It's easy to prioritize those. But identification and prioritization of side effects is quite a different story. And of course, consumers want to know about every possibility out there and what percent of the time they're found. But have you dealt with this in the UK, and how have you dealt with it?
I think there's two things there. The first thing is, I think if you're going to go into side effects, you need the numbers. You need numbers of people to be having an interaction with to ensure that you've uncovered all those possible side effects that may or may not bother people about their treatments. So, if I was commenting on a project that had 3 people involved, I would feel that was not enough. So there does need to be an extra effort there. When I've done work on outcomes, what the difficulty is actually how you communicate what you mean by outcomes. And it was one of the hardest things when we did an outcomes project in chronic sinusitis, was to try and communicate to the public what we were after. Because if we said just side effects, that's all we would have got back, was just side effects. But we were interested in the whole range of potential outcomes. And this was for Cochrane reviews in chronic sinusitis. So we had to pilot our survey 3 times to get the right wording, which is a bit horrendous given our time frame. I'm not sure I've answered your question on that front. Have I? Maybe not. Okay, we're on a journey. I think the other thing I would say is that in any project, and I feel strongly that we sometimes just go for one modality, one type of involvement. And the reason I put up that really busy graph thing, which, to any statistician in the room or any economic, they think that doesn't mean anything. But to me, it means that we need to provide opportunities for people to get involved in different ways that play to their interests and strengths. So it's a bit like being a lift, back to ladders again, lifts and ladders. But you can entry at one and just give something really simple as part of your involvement. And then you can get off the lift and you might never ever get involved again, but you've done your bit, you've said your piece. Or you can stay in the lift and go right to the top and end up on a guideline development group and be giving a much more sophisticated and nuanced type of involvement. And I think that we must try and provide our public with those choices of how to get involved, whether it's outcomes or any other type of healthcare discussion. I think outcomes is an untapped area for public involvement personally. I think, and I know Vinay touched on it this morning, I do think we need much more debate around how we have those conversations. And I guess the core outcomes work is part of that. That's beginning to develop methods and approaches that really reach quite wide and deep for people's experiences of outcomes.
Let me just add that there was the PROTECT trial in the UK that recruited 186,000 men, and they were trying to look at difference in outcomes between surgery and radiation. And they, from the beginning, and we're now getting to the 15-year mark, they were doing a very effective job of making sure that they understood what quality of life was from the patient perspective. So the UK is doing some stuff really, really well.
I'd like to pick up on Marguerite Koster's point on we're at a difficult time, and I suspect there'll be a lot of letters generated soon questioning some of the research cuts and the atrophy of ARC and the reorganizations. And I hope as Q becomes aware of these kind of letters and efforts, at least for my organization, I hope you'll forward them in emails that we might participate and join in them. And things like the March for Science in Washington on the 22nd of April. I plan to be there, even though I'm not a scientist. I believe in it, and I think it'll be in a number of other cities. And if we got information on that, and if Q might be a way of forwarding it to us, that'd be wonderful for my group.
I actually have one more question. I noticed on your prioritization, or you had 5-step process, was that right? So I've been involved in a couple prioritization exercises. I found them very interesting. I actually really like that. I think it's fun for improving health systems in particular. But for you only gave a couple examples, but I found a huge difference between the online and meeting in person. For one of them, we had an online exercise, and it was, mostly professionals, doctors, researchers. And then when we met in person, how much the statistics changed. But we were able to discuss online together in that platform as well as in person, but the in person was really an imperative to get the outcomes I think that we were hoping to get, hearing from different people. Thank you.
I think that's a really interesting point, because a lot of prioritization is done using Delphi exercises. People heard of Delphi? It's like a sort of system of surveying. And I'm not sure how accessible they are for people, actually, and they're quite hard going to complete. But you're absolutely right, is that when you move from online work and numbers work into more illustrative and experiential discussions around priorities, things do change. And I wouldn't want to see us lose that element of the process. We've been challenged and said, well, why don't you just go on the votes? That's the most important thing, and that's where your numbers are. But we've seen really sophisticated conversations in workshops that I think lead us to better prioritize topics, where actually, and don't forget, this is about consensus. It's about, at the end of the day, and we walk out that door, what can we all feel comfortable with in that list? And people come in with agendas, of course they do. And it's about how you work with those and how you achieve a consensus across what is often a very diverse group of people, because we select and invite people to these workshops from very diverse groups deliberately to get that spread of expertise. But it's an interesting dynamic, and I wish we evaluated it more, actually. I wish we did more work on what actually happens in that interaction between humans. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally and Margaret.